To my son, I'm just a living vault, a collection of assets to be liquidated. I caught him rigging our historic home to burn, his pockets stuffed with an insurance claim on my life's work. When my chest tightened and I needed my pills, he whispered, "Die already," and hid them. He thinks he's trapped a helpless old woman, but I am the city's head archivist. I know every loose floorboard and secret passage in this mansion. I've already made the first call. Listen until the end to hear his downfall, and please subscribe to support my story. The header screamed at me from the top of the page, "Total loss." 2 words, said in that self-important Helvetica font insurance companies use when they want to sound official while they're gutting you. I didn't need to read the actuarial footnotes or the adjusted replacement cost calculations to understand what I was looking at. This wasn't a projection. It was a death warrant. $2 million. That's what Julian had determined the Vance estate was worth, in ashes. The briefcase sat open on the mahogany desk Thomas had restored himself, back when his hands were still steady and the Parkinson's was just a tremor we could ignore. The leather case smelled wrong. Airport rain. That's synthetic, recycled air from the Minneapolis concourse. And underneath it, something sharper. Ambition, maybe. Or just cheap cologne masking cheaper intentions. My fingers, gnarled now, the joints swollen with arthritis that turned every movement into a small negotiation with pain, traced the projected payout line. The paper was high bond stationery, the kind that costs extra because it photographs well in courtrooms. $7.2 million for the land. $2 million for the accidental incineration of the structure and its contents. Minus the mortgage lien. Minus the estate taxes he'd already calculated. Net proceeds, $6.4 million. I could see the math in my head, arranged in the neat columns I'd used for 40 years in the archives. Julian had done his homework. He'd factored in the historic preservation tax credits, the itemized depreciation schedule, even the goddamn dehumidifier's replacement value. What he hadn't factored in was that I could read an insurance fraud claim the way a cardiologist reads an EKG, and this one was flatlined from the start. My sanctuary. My husband's legacy. The house Thomas had carried me into on our wedding night, the same house where I'd held his hand as the cancer ate through him like acid through paper. Julian wasn't visiting. He was here to liquidate. "You're looking thin, Mother." His voice cut through the humidity like a blade wrapped in velvet. I didn't turn around. I knew exactly where he was standing, 3 steps inside the study, his shadow falling across the Persian rug Thomas had bought at auction in 1987. The floorboard under his left foot was screaming. He didn't know to shift his weight 2 inches to the right where the joist was solid. Like old parchment, he continued, moving closer. That Minnesota drawl he'd cultivated, all smooth vowels and implied concern. "I worry about you down here all alone." I held the document up without looking at him. The paper rattled in the draft from the dehumidifier, a 60-cycle hum that had been the soundtrack of my life for 2 decades. 90% humidity outside. The Savannah summer pressing against the windows like a living thing. The crawlspace reeks of regular unleaded, Julian. My voice was steady. Archival quality. Care to explain why our home is worth more as a charcoal briquette? The floorboards shrieked as he crossed the room. Designer loafers, Italian, probably. The kind with the little tassels that cost $600 and announce to everyone within earshot that you don't know how to walk quietly. He moved with that athletic stride he'd perfected, all shoulders and performance. The walk of a man who thinks his body is a resume. He reached for the paper. I watched his hand extend toward me, the fingers spread wide. He was 42 years old, my son. My only child. And I didn't recognize the man behind those shifty brown eyes. They were his father's eyes once. Now they looked like something you'd see across a poker table, calculating odds, measuring angles. He smiled. The corners of his mouth lifted in that practiced expression that had probably closed deals in Minneapolis, charmed investors, seduced creditors into extending his line of credit one more month. The smile never touched his eyes. He didn't take the paper. He took my wrist. His hand was cold despite the heat, the grip damp with sweat or nerves or whatever leaked out of men like him when they were about to do something they couldn't take back. The pressure was precise, not enough to bruise, but enough to make it clear I wasn't in control anymore. With his free hand, he wrenched open my bedside drawer. The one next to the reading chair where I kept my medications arranged by urgency. He knew exactly what he was looking for. The small brown vial. Nitroglycerin, 0.4 milligrams sublingual tablets. 30 pills that stood between me and a massive myocardial infarction. Your heart, mother. He snatched the bottle, the pills rattling inside like dry bones in a crypt. It's making you paranoid. I reached for them. Instinct. The same instinct that makes you grab for the railing when you feel yourself falling. My chest was already tightening, the familiar pressure building behind my sternum like a fist slowly clenching around my aorta. He pulled the vial away, held it up to the light like he was examining a specimen. The amber plastic glowed. Then he slipped it into his pocket. Just like that. My lifeline. Gone. He turned to the bedside cabinet, the antique apothecary chest Thomas had found at an estate sale in Charleston. The one with the silver key that hung on a ribbon inside the drawer. Julian plucked it out with 2 fingers, inserted it into the lock with the practiced ease of someone who'd been planning this moment for a long time. The lock turned with a snick. The sound echoed through the high-ceilinged room, bouncing off the crown molding and the plaster medallions and all the architectural details that made this place worth killing for. It was the sound of a door closing. A shutter slamming shut. The sound of my life being locked away from me. You're sounding confused again. He leaned in close. Too close. I could smell his breath, peppermint gum working overtime to mask something sour underneath. Ketosis, maybe. The smell of a man who skips meals because he's too busy running his schemes to eat. The neighbors have noticed the wandering. I hadn't wandered anywhere. I took the same walk every morning at 6:15, circling the garden path Thomas had laid in 1992, checking the oleander and the azaleas and the jasmine that climbed the east wall. Mrs. Patterson next door waved to me every single day. The living vault is leaking memories. There it was. The nickname the Savannah Historical Society had given me when I retired, turned into a weapon. Eleanor Vance, the woman who could recall every deed, every property dispute, every buried scandal in 300 years of Georgia lowcountry history. Now, according to Julian's carefully constructed narrative, I was a malfunctioning hard drive. This was a script. I could see the beats of it, the practiced pauses. He'd rehearsed this. Probably in front of a mirror, timing the delivery, calibrating the tone to hit that perfect note of concerned son dealing with a declining parent. It was the foundation for a 5,150 hold. Or an APS investigation. Adult Protective Services, the state agency that could swoop in and declare an elderly person mentally incompetent, strip away their autonomy, assign them a guardian. He was building a paper trail. Confused. Paranoid. Wandering. Unsafe. He was painting me as a senile relic to justify the fire, the facility, the systematic theft of everything Thomas and I had built. He patted my cheek. The gesture was so patronizing it felt like a slap. His palm was warm, slightly damp. It lingered for 2 seconds longer than necessary. To him, I wasn't a person anymore. I was a ledger entry he was preparing to write off. I turned toward the door. My heels, the low-heeled pumps I'd worn to work for 40 years, clicked against the hardwood in a rhythm that sounded frantic even to my own ears. 2 steps. 3. The exit was blocked. Brenda stood in the doorway, filling the frame with her bulk. She was a large woman, not fat but solid, built like someone who'd worked in hospitals long enough to know how to move bodies that didn't want to be moved. White polyester uniform. Sensible shoes. A laminated ID badge clipped to her breast pocket that I'd never bothered to read because I'd assumed, foolishly, that she was here to help me. She didn't say a word. She just placed her hand on my shoulder. The grip was heavy, the fingers digging in through the silk of my blouse. Professional. Practiced. The kind of hold they teach you in nursing school when you're dealing with a combative patient. She steered me back toward the bed. I tried to resist. I'm 5'4" and 125 pounds. She outweighed me by at least 80 pounds and had the leverage of youth and muscle memory. It wasn't even a contest. The mattress hit the backs of my knees and I sat. Hard. The antique bed frame creaked, the springs protesting. Brenda stood there, her hand still on my shoulder, her face arranged in an expression of what was probably supposed to be compassionate concern. Her eyes were flat. Empty. The eyes of someone who'd stopped seeing patients as people a long time ago. I was a prisoner in the master suite. Guarded by a mercenary in a nurse's uniform while my son prepared to burn the world down around me. I waited. Patience is an archivist's virtue. You learn to wait for documents to be retrieved from storage, for microfilm to load, for probate records to be unsealed. You learn that rushing gets you nothing but errors. Brenda eventually moved away from the door. I heard her heavy footsteps retreat down the hallway, heard her speaking in low tones to someone, Julian, probably, near the landing. I moved to the doorway. Silent. The trick is to keep your weight distributed evenly, to avoid the boards that groan. I've lived in this house for 43 years. I know every structural flaw, every loose nail, every joist that's rotted out from the inside. From the shadows of the second-floor landing, I watched the sacrilege begin. Julian was downstairs in the parlor with a man I'd never seen before. Clipboard. Utility vest. The kind of person who gets paid by the hour to dismantle other people's lives. An appraiser, probably. Or a salvage dealer. Someone with vulture eyes and a manifest. They stood before the Carrara marble mantel. Thomas and I had found it in 1979, buried under 6 coats of paint in a condemned building on Bull Street. It dated to 1840, hand-carved in Italy, shipped to Savannah before the Civil War. We'd spent 3 years restoring it, using dental tools to clean out the acanthus leaves, sourcing period-appropriate plaster to fill the chips. It was the crown jewel of the parlor. Careful with the removal, Julian said. His voice echoed up the grand staircase, bouncing off the plaster and the 100-year-old wallpaper. I want these out before that accident happens. The appraiser made a note on his clipboard. Pre-fire preservation, Julian continued. We'll call it that. They were stripping the house of its soul before the execution. Looting the body while it was still warm. The marble. The mahogany wainscoting. The stained glass transom above the front door that had survived Sherman's March and Hurricane David and a century of hurricanes that didn't even get names. I gripped the banister. The wood was cold under my palm, smooth from decades of hands sliding down its length. My heart was doing that thing it does when the arrhythmia kicks in, 1 2, 1 2, skip, 1. I needed my medication. The heat was a physical enemy now. Savannah in August is an oppression. 96 degrees outside. 90% humidity. The air so thick you can chew it. Inside the house, even with the dehumidifier running, it was like breathing through a wet wool blanket. My heart skipped again. 1 2, gap, 1. A cold spark of alarm radiated down my left arm, that telltale ache that every cardiac patient learns to recognize. It starts in the chest, then creeps down to the elbow, the wrist, the fingers. A warning shot across the bow. I gripped the banister harder, my knuckles going white. The wood was the only solid thing in a world that had started to tilt sideways. Without the nitroglycerin, the stress of watching them gut my home was a literal death sentence. The medication worked by dilating the blood vessels, easing the workload on the heart. Without it, every emotional spike, every surge of adrenaline, was pushing me closer to the edge. Julian wasn't just waiting for my heart to fail. He was actively orchestrating the environment to ensure it did. The heat. The stress. The isolation. The theft of my medication. It was all designed to create the perfect conditions for a cardiac event. And when it happened, when I collapsed, gasping, my lips turning blue, he'd call 911, play the devastated son, tell the EMTs I'd been confused, wandering, refusing to take my pills. Natural causes. No autopsy required. I realized, standing there on the landing with my left arm going numb, that Julian had designed my death as carefully as Thomas had designed our garden. I forced my mind to do what it does best. Archive the panic. File it away under irrelevant. Focus on the problem at hand. The ghost phone. In 2008, Thomas came home from the precinct with a burner phone. Not the modern kind, not some disposable smartphone from a gas station. A Nokia 3310. The brick. The indestructible relic of the early cell phone era. Old detective habit, he'd said, tucking it behind the loose floorboard in the pantry. You never know when you'll need a fallback. He'd kept it charged. Every 6 months, he'd pull it out, plug it into the wall, make sure the battery still held. It was his paranoia, his cop brain always planning for the worst-case scenario. He died in 2019. I'd found the phone when I was cleaning out his things, considered throwing it away, then decided to honor his neurosis. I'd kept charging it. Kept it hidden. Julian thought he'd neutralized my tech by changing the Wi-Fi password and seizing my smartphone. He'd cut me off from email, from text messages, from the cloud where I stored my documents. But he forgot that I knew every structural fluke of this estate. He forgot that Thomas had taught me to think like a detective. And he forgot that in this house, the old relics were the only things that still held power. I had a lifeline he didn't even know existed. The house was my map. Every creak. Every groan. Every dead zone where the 19th century joists remained silent. I waited, watching Brenda from the shadows. She was standing near the landing, her attention drawn to the parlor below where the appraiser's hammer had started tapping against the marble, testing for weak points in the mortar. I moved. The trick is to walk like a ghost. Keep your weight on the balls of your feet. Distribute the pressure evenly. Avoid the boards that run perpendicular to the joists, those are the ones that sing. I slipped into the servants' staircase. It's a narrow passage, lightless, built into the wall between the kitchen and the main house. In the 1890s, this was how the help moved through the estate without being seen by the family. Now it was my escape route. The air inside was cooler, stagnant. It smelled like dust and old plaster and something faintly organic, mouse droppings, probably, or the dried corpses of insects. My breath came in shallow wheezes, the humidity making my lungs work overtime. But my feet found the dead zones with instinctive precision. I'd walked this path 1,000 times, usually carrying laundry or extra linens, sometimes just to enjoy the secret thrill of moving through my own house unseen. I descended 13 steps, counting them the way I always did. 13 steps to the landing. Turn left. 6 more steps to the kitchen level. I vanished from the second floor before Brenda could even blink. The pantry smelled like lemon oil and dry pasta. I knelt, my joints popping like dry twigs snapping underfoot. The sound was obscenely loud in the enclosed space, but there was no one here to hear it. The kitchen was empty, the door to the main house closed. I found the loose board near the base of the flour bin. It's the third one from the wall, marked by a tiny notch Thomas had carved with his pocket knife, invisible unless you knew to look for it. I pried it up with my fingernails, the wood splintering slightly. My hands were shaking now, the adrenaline and the cardiac strain making fine motor control a challenge. My fingers brushed cold plastic. Pebbled. The unmistakable texture of a Nokia 3310. I pulled it out, cradling it in my palm like an artifact. It felt heavy, substantial in a way modern phones don't. This was a device built before planned obsolescence, before phones became disposable accessories. My heart hammered against my ribs. 1-2 skip 1-2. A dangerous, erratic rhythm that made the edges of my vision start to gray. Not yet, I told myself. Not yet. I retreated back into the servants' passage, pulling the pantry door shut behind me. The darkness swallowed me whole. I stood there in the narrow space between the walls, surrounded by the smell of old wood and hidden histories. This was the only safety I had left in my own home. A dead zone. A place Julian didn't know existed. I pressed the power button. The screen glowed with that ghostly, low-resolution green light, the color of old computer monitors and obsolete technology. The Nokia startup chime was a tinny, electronic melody, but I muted it with my thumb before it could finish the first note. Battery, 3 bars. Thomas had always been meticulous. Even in death, his habits were keeping me alive. I scrolled through the contact list. There were only 5 entries. Thomas hadn't believed in storing numbers he didn't absolutely need. Miller, work. Detective Marcus Miller. Thomas's partner for 12 years at the Savannah Chatham Metropolitan Police Department. They'd worked homicides together, closed cases together, attended each other's family barbecues. Miller would be in his late 60s now. Retired, probably. Or maybe promoted to captain and riding out his last few years behind a desk. But he was a man who understood the Vivance way. Thomas had a code, a methodology for handling problems. Miller knew it. Respected it. The phone was live. Fully charged. Hidden. Untraceable to Julian's sweep of my technology. I wasn't just a victim in a decaying mansion anymore. I was a witness with a direct line to the law. I leaned against the rough-hewn lath of the inner wall, the darkness pressing in around me like water. The maternal instinct, the one that had made me defend Julian through his 20s, through his failed businesses and his manipulative ex-wife and his mounting debts, finally curdled. It didn't die quickly. It died the way things die in archives, slowly, through neglect and the accumulation of evidence. I didn't see a son anymore. I saw a fraudulent developer. A thief. A man who was willing to let me burn alive for $6.4 million and a chance to restart his life without the burden of a failing mother. I saw a potential murderer. I closed my eyes, visualizing the archives of his crimes. I'd already begun building them in my head, the way I used to catalog documents at the Historical Society. Exhibit A, the insurance claim, with its detailed payout structure and accelerant-friendly timeline. Exhibit B, the smell of gasoline in the crawlspace, the cans he thought I was too senile to notice. Exhibit C, the theft of my medication, the deliberate creation of a stress environment designed to trigger cardiac arrest. Exhibit D, the fake nurse, the blocked exits, the systematic isolation. I wasn't going to the state care facility. I wasn't going to die in a fire while Julian watched from the lawn, playing the role of the devastated heir for the insurance adjusters. I was going to index Julian Vance under incarcerated. The architect of justice was open for business. The white aspirin tablets mocked me, chalky and useless in the palm of my hand. I stared at them, my vision tunneling down to those perfect little discs. They were pharmaceutical-grade placebos, stamped with the same manufacturer's mark as the real nitroglycerin. Someone, Julian, had gone to the trouble of sourcing the exact right size, the exact right color, to make the substitution seamless. This wasn't a mistake. It was an edit. Julian had gone through my emergency kits like a censor working through classified documents, systematically removing the living parts of my history and replacing them with useless facsimiles. The backup medication in the laundry room. Probably the spare vial I kept in the garden shed, too. Every contingency I'd prepared, every fallback Thomas had insisted on, all of it neutralized. The cruelty of it was breathtaking. He wanted me to find this. Wanted me to feel that final spike of hope before realizing the floor had been pulled out from under me. It was psychological torture dressed up as thoroughness. The same way he'd replaced my real phone with a disconnected shell, the same way he'd staged the confused wandering narrative for the neighbors. He wasn't just killing me. He was archiving my failure. My own son had turned my sanctuary into a curated execution chamber, and every detail, down to the fake pills in the emergency kit, was designed to break me before the fire even started. I let the aspirin fall from my palm. The tablets scattered across the concrete floor, bouncing once before coming to rest in the dust. Useless. Midnight came not with silence, but with the rhythmic, heavy thud of plastic against concrete. I stood in the shadows of the back stairs, my hand pressed against the rough brick of the foundation wall, and listened to my son carry death into the basement. Each footfall was accompanied by the unmistakable slosh of liquid, regular unleaded, the scent rising through the floorboards like a toxic fog, curling up through the heating vents and the gaps in the old flooring. The smell hit the back of my throat, chemical and sharp. It was the smell of gas stations and lawnmowers and suburban Saturday mornings. It had no business being inside a house. Julian wasn't being careful anymore. The pretense of the concerned son had evaporated the moment Brenda sealed the doors. Now he moved with a frantic, desperate energy, hauling red plastic 5-gallon cans from wherever he'd hidden them, the garage, probably, or the garden shed behind the oleander. I counted them by sound. 1, 2, 3, 4. 20 gallons of accelerant. Enough to turn a century-old mansion into a crematorium in under 30 minutes. Each heavy step he took on the basement stairs felt like a hammer blow against my chest. My heart responded with its own erratic percussion, thump-thump-skip-thump. The arrhythmia was worsening, the stress pushing my cardiovascular system toward the edge of total failure. He was prepping the kindling for his $2 million payday, arranging the cans in what I assumed was some sort of pattern designed to maximize the spread, to ensure the fire reached every corner of the foundation before the structure could be saved. He was oblivious to the fact that the living vault was watching his every move from the darkness. I moved through the servants' passage to the pantry, my feet finding the silent zones automatically. Muscle memory. 43 years of walking these floors. I pressed my eye to the decorative brass vent in the pantry wall, an original 1890s feature, designed to allow heat to circulate between rooms. Now it was my surveillance point. Through the ornate grillwork, I had a direct sightline into the study. Julian was hunched over Thomas's wall safe. The safe Thomas had installed himself in 1995, set into the brick chimney breast, hidden behind a false panel that matched the walnut wainscoting. It was a Gardal berated model, half-inch steel door, mechanical lock with a key override. The high-pitched whine of a handheld angle grinder set my teeth on edge. The sound was a mechanical scream, a shriek of metal on metal that tore through the silence of the house. Sparks showered across Julian's expensive wool trousers, charcoal gray, probably Brooks Brothers or some Minneapolis equivalent, but he didn't flinch. He was a man possessed. This was the Minnesota Nice version of bloodlust. Clean. Calculated. Utterly cold. No rage. No emotion. Just the systematic destruction of a security measure that stood between him and what he wanted. He was cutting into the heart of my sanctuary, destroying the very steel that was meant to keep our secret safe. The grinder bit deeper, the shower of sparks intensifying, casting his face in an orange glow that made him look demonic. I watched his jaw clench with concentration, watched the tendons in his forearms flex as he guided the blade through the locking mechanism. This was my son. This was the boy I'd nursed through chickenpox and driven to soccer practice and helped with algebra homework. This was a stranger wearing his face. The safe door creaked open, the hinges protesting after being violated by industrial tools. Julian reached inside, his fingers trembling. Not with fear. With greed. He pulled out the velvet-lined mahogany cases. 3 of them. Each one custom-made by a woodworker in Charleston, fitted with foam inserts to cradle the coins without scratching them. These weren't just coins. They were Thomas's life's work. He'd started collecting in his 20s, long before we met. Walking Liberty $50. Morgan silver dollars. St. Gaudens double eagles. Every piece had a story: the 1921 piece dollar he'd found at an estate sale in Beaufort, the 1893 S. Morgan he'd saved for 3 years to afford, the 1927 double eagle that was supposed to be my legacy, the thing I'd sell if I ever needed long-term care. Julian opened the first case. Then he began dumping them into a generic nylon duffel bag. Not gently. Not with any care for the preservation of the collection. He appended each case and let the coins cascade into the bag like garbage, the metallic clinking sounding like a funeral dirge. 90 ounces of gold. 120 ounces of silver. Coins that carried the weight of American history, that had survived the Depression and 2 world wars and countless economic collapses. He didn't care about the provenance. Didn't care about the artistry of the engraving or the historical significance or the fact that some of these pieces were graded MS-65 by PCGS and worth 10 times their melt value. He only saw liquid value. Dollar signs. A way to pay off whatever debt was chasing him in Minneapolis. He was stripping the estate to the bone before the fire could claim the rest. A sharp, icy needle of pain pierced my left shoulder. I gasped, my hand flying up to clutch at the joint. The pain radiated upward, spreading like frost across my collarbone, creeping up the side of my neck. My vision swam. The edges of the room frayed into dull gray static, the kind of visual distortion that meant my brain wasn't getting enough oxygen. The stress was no longer a mental burden. It was a physical siege. My heart skipped 3 beats in a row, leaving a hollow, terrifying void in my chest where the rhythm should have been. 1, 2, 3, thump. The 4th beat came late, hard, like a fist slamming against the inside of my ribcage. I sagged against the wall, the rough plaster digging into my spine through the silk of my blouse. The humid air felt thin, useless. I was pulling in full breaths, but my lungs couldn't seem to extract any oxygen from them. Everything felt wrong. Distant. Like I was observing my own body from somewhere outside it. This was it. This was the cardiac event Julian had been engineering. Without the nitroglycerin he'd stolen, I was a clock winding down in a house that was about to be set ablaze. I had to move, or I would die in the dark. The Nokia was still clutched in my right hand, the plastic slick with sweat. I forced my fingers to maintain their grip, forced my legs to hold my weight. Not yet. Not yet. I had work to finish. Eleanor? Mother? This isn't funny. Brenda's voice boomed from the landing, stripped of every trace of its earlier nursing professional veneer. No more soft concern, no more therapeutic tone. This was the voice of a woman who was tired of the charade. I heard the heavy clack of the front door's deadbolt sliding home. Then the side entrance. Then the conservatory door that led out to the garden. She was sealing the tomb. Julian had instructed her to be the jailer, and she was performing her duties with sadistic efficiency. Probably paying her extra for every exit she secured, every avenue of escape she eliminated. I heard her heavy footfalls as she began a systematic, room-by-room sweep of the 2nd floor. Master bedroom. Guest room. The bathroom with the clawfoot tub. Thomas's old office. She was methodical. Professional. This wasn't her first time hunting someone through a house. "I know you're hiding somewhere," she called out, her voice echoing through the empty rooms. "You're going to hurt yourself, Eleanor. Let me help you back to bed." She was looking for a frail old woman. A confused, wandering invalid who needed to be sedated and tucked away until the fire department arrived to find her body. She didn't realize she was hunting a ghost who knew the shadows better than she knew the light. I retreated further into the dead zone. There's a narrow gap between the parlor's lath-and-plaster wall and the library's built-in shelving, an architectural anomaly created when they renovated in 1923 and didn't quite align the rooms properly. It's maybe 18 inches wide, dark as a grave, and accessible only if you know where to push on the decorative panel. I slipped inside, pulling the panel shut behind me. Dust motes danced in the sliver of light that crept in from the hallway. The air was stale, thick with the smell of old wood and mouse droppings and a century of accumulated neglect. I held my breath, my lungs burning with the effort. Brenda's shadow loomed large against the wallpaper just inches away from where I stood. I could see her through the crack where the panel didn't quite meet the frame. She paused, turning her head slowly, sniffing the air like a predator. She was close enough that I could see the thick, utilitarian soles of her shoes. White orthopedic clogs, the kind with the rubber grip. Practical. Made for 12-hour shifts standing on hospital linoleum. If she pushed on the panel, the game was over. The hidden latch would give way under pressure, and she'd find me pressed into the gap like a specimen in a killing jar. I could hear her breathing. Heavy. Annoyed. "Where the hell are you?" she muttered. She stood there for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 30 seconds. Then her frustration mounted, her patience wearing thin, and her footsteps receded toward the kitchen. I exhaled slowly, the breath coming out in a silent wheeze. I was safe. For now. In the architecture of my own history. Headlights cut through the Spanish moss outside, sweeping across the parlor windows in a predatory arc. I moved to the edge of the gap, pressing my eye to the crack in the panel. Through the wavy glass of the antique windows, I watched a black SUV pull into the circular driveway. Sleek. Anonymous. Tinted windows. The kind of vehicle that screams, "I don't want to be remembered." The engine killed. The lights died. The driver's door opened and a man stepped out. 40s, maybe. Dark suit. No tie. The kind of person who does business at midnight because daylight is too exposing. This was the midnight buyer. The black market broker Julian had contacted to offload the coins before the accidental fire. It was a classic insurance fraud scheme, a double dip. Steal the physical assets. Sell them under the table for immediate cash. Then collect the insurance payout on the lost property. Julian was a man of many layers. All of them rotten. I watched the buyer approach the front door. Julian opened it before the man could knock, ushering him inside with a smile I could see even from my hiding place. That performative grin. All teeth and calculation. I clutched the Nokia, my thumb hovering over the call button. The stage was set for a recording. I dialed Miller. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped the phone. The arthritis in my fingers made the small buttons a challenge, but muscle memory from a decade ago kicked in. I found the contact, pressed call. The line connected. 1 ring. 2. Vance residence, Miller's voice came through, rough with age and probably whiskey. "Thomas, that you?" I didn't say a word. I simply held the phone out toward the brass vent as Julian led the buyer into the study. The ventilation shaft would carry their voices directly to the phone's microphone. Perfect acoustics. Thomas had always joked that you could hear a conversation from 3 rooms away if you stood in the right spot. It's a clean break, Julian's voice boomed through the vent, projecting that false confidence he wore like cologne. The old woman's heart is a ticking bomb. Another month, maybe 2, and nature would take its course. But I don't have 2 months. The coins are authentic? The buyer's voice was flat. Transactional. Thomas Vance collected for 40 years. Every piece is graded. Every piece is documented. You're looking at $260,000, minimum, if you move them to the right dealers. And the fire? The fire department will find her in her bed. Natural causes complicated by smoke inhalation. The coins, well, the coins will be vaporized in the heat. Gold melts at 1,948 degrees Fahrenheit. A house fire hits 1,500 easy. It's a perfect liquidation. Every word was a nail in his coffin. Broadcast directly to a man who had spent 20 years putting people like Julian behind bars. I didn't need to say anything. Miller would understand. He'd record this. Run a trace on the location. Send units. All I had to do was keep the line open. A sudden, violent vibration shook the wall behind me. Brenda had found the servants' passage door in the pantry. Thump. 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 The wood groaned under her weight. She was throwing her shoulder against it, trying to force the latch. I know you're in there, Eleanor. Her voice was a jagged edge of false concern, the nursing persona completely shattered now. You're going to hurt yourself. You could fall. You could have a stroke. She was trying to sound worried, but the undertone was pure rage. Frustration. She'd been hired to do a job, keep the old woman contained, and I was making her look incompetent. The latch rattled. The old brass hardware was strong, installed in 1890 when they built things to last, but Brenda outweighed me by 80 pounds and had leverage on her side. Thump. Thump. The wood cracked. I couldn't stay in the dead zone anymore. The sanctuary had become a trap. My only path was down. Into the basement, where the gasoline and the final reckoning awaited. I descended the servants' stairs, each step a calculated risk. The passage was steep, the risers uneven, built for a smaller staff in an era when servants were expected to be invisible and disposable. My knees screamed with every inch I lowered myself, the cartilage grinding bone against bone. The air grew cooler but heavier. The smell of damp earth and fuel intensified, becoming almost unbearable. My lungs rebelled, wheezing with each breath. The physical exertion was pushing my heart toward total breakdown. I could feel it stuttering in my chest, the rhythm completely erratic now. Thump thump, skip, thump skip skip, thump. I gripped the railing, a simple iron pipe bolted to the brick, and forced myself to keep moving. I had to reach the laundry room. Years ago, maybe 2010 or 2011, Thomas had insisted on emergency measures. You never know when you'll need a fallback, he'd said, taping a medical kit to the back of the heavy iron boiler. Aspirin. Bandages. And yes, a backup supply of nitroglycerin. It was my last hope for a dose of medication to keep my heart beating long enough to finish this. If it was still there. If Julian hadn't found it. If the humidity hadn't destroyed the pills. If. At the bottom of the stairs, my foot slipped on something slick. I grabbed the wall to steady myself, my palms slapping against damp brick. The cold moisture seeped into my silk sleeve, spreading like a stain. I looked down. A dark, shimmering ribbon of gasoline snaked across the concrete floor, leading directly from the storage area to the base of the wooden support beams. The overhead joists. The century-old timber that held up the entire first floor. Julian had laid the fuse. One match, and the entire history of the Vance family would be reduced to ash in under an hour. The accelerant would follow the path he designed, racing along the beams, climbing the walls, consuming everything in its path. The fire would start here, in the basement, where no smoke detectors existed. By the time anyone noticed, the first floor would be engulfed. And I would be unconscious, or dead, in my bed on the second floor. The sight of it, the sheer, murderous greed, gave me a jolt of adrenaline that cut through the exhaustion like a blade. I wasn't going to let him win. I reached the boiler, my breath coming in ragged, shallow gulps. The old iron casing was still there, a relic from 1960 when they converted from coal to oil. It hadn't been used in 20 years, but it was too heavy to remove, so it just sat there in the corner, rusting quietly. I reached behind it, my arm disappearing into the narrow gap between the boiler and the brick wall. My fingers brushed plastic. The emergency kit. Thank God. I pulled it free, my hands trembling so violently I could barely maintain my grip. The red plastic case was dusty, covered in cobwebs, but intact. I popped the latch, desperate for the small brown vial of life-saving pills. The lid fell away. My heart sank. The seal was already broken. Someone had been here before me. The vial was there, exactly where it should have been. But the label had been peeled back, reaffixed at a crooked angle. Inside, the pills were too large. Too white. Too perfect. Aspirin. Julian had found this, too. He'd anticipated my move, thought through every possible contingency, every backup plan. He had replaced my life with a decoy. The basement floor was cold, the concrete leaching the last of my warmth through my silk blouse and wool trousers. I collapsed to my knees, unable to support my own weight anymore. The impact sent a jolt of pain up through my kneecaps, but it was nothing compared to the agony in my chest. It felt like someone had wrapped a rusted winch around my ribcage and was slowly, methodically, cranking it tighter. Each breath was a shallow, jagged sip of air that didn't seem to contain any oxygen. My lungs were working, pulling in volume, but the exchange wasn't happening. Carbon dioxide was building up in my bloodstream, making my head swim. I leaned my forehead against the cool, damp brick of the foundation wall. The moisture felt good against my overheated skin, a small mercy in a world that had run out of them. The shadows began to distort. The water heater stretched into a predatory shape, all angles and threat. The overhead pipes twisted into skeletal fingers reaching for me. I was 68 years old. Unmedicated. Trapped in a subterranean tomb of my own making. For a moment, the silence was so heavy I thought my heart had finally stopped. I waited for the darkness to take me, for the pain to end, for whatever came after to announce itself. But my heart, stubborn and damaged as it was, kept beating. Thump, skip, thump thump, skip. Not yet, it seemed to say. Not yet. Clink. Clink. The sound filtered down through the floorboards above me, gold hitting wood, a rhythmic metallic heartbeat that was somehow worse than silence. The buyer was counting. I could hear them through the heating duct that ran along the basement ceiling. The low murmur of a man who dealt in shadows, his voice flat and transactional. And underneath it, the eager, frantic pitch of Julian's voice, rising and falling with barely contained excitement. 42 double eagles, the buyer said. Grade? MS 63 to MS 65. Most of them are 1924 and 1927. A few earlier dates. The silver? Morgan dollars, mostly. Some piece dollars. 1890 through 21. They were weighing my husband's legacy in grams and carats, reducing 40 years of careful collecting to spot prices and melt values. Thomas had acquired each coin with love, researching the mintage numbers, the die variations, the historical context. He'd kept detailed ledgers, noting where he'd bought each piece, what he'd paid, why it mattered. To Julian, they were just portable wealth. Unaware that the woman who knew the true value of every coin, who could recite the provenance of each piece from memory, was rotting in the dark beneath them. Julian laughed. A sharp, ugly sound that cut through the humidity and the gasoline fumes. He was already spending the money. Already calculating how much of his Minneapolis debt this would erase, how much breathing room it would buy him. Don't worry about the noise, Julian's voice drifted down through the ventilation duct, clear as a bell. The acoustics of this house were Thomas's unintentional gift. Every whisper carried. Every confession broadcast. She's either passed out or too confused to know what floor she's on. By the time the first spark hits the fuel, she'll be a non-factor. A pause. The sound of something heavy being moved, one of the gas cans, probably. It's a mercy, really. She's been dead since my father died, she just forgot to stop breathing. The buyer grunted. A sound of indifferent agreement. The noise you make when someone tells you it's going to rain and you don't particularly care one way or the other. They weren't just discussing a transaction. They were discussing my erasure. Julian spoke of me as an obstacle to be cleared. A line of code to be deleted. A problem that had persisted longer than it should have, finally being resolved through the elegant solution of arson and natural causes. When? The buyer asked. 2 a.m. House is isolated enough that no one will notice until the roof goes. By then, it'll be too hot for anyone to get inside. And the nurse? Brenda? She'll be the one who calls it in. Devastated. Did everything she could. The confused patient must have been wandering, knocked over a candle, something. EMTs will find mother in her bed. Heart attack complicated by smoke inhalation. Clean. Very. Something inside me, the soft, irrational part that still remembered Julian as a boy with scraped knees and a gap-toothed smile, finally withered. It didn't die with a bang. It died with a cold, archival click. The sound of a file drawer closing. A record being sealed. I stopped seeing a sun. I saw a structural defect in the Vance line. A corruption in the data. A falsified record that needed to be corrected. If he wanted a living vault, I would give him exactly what was stored inside. Not love. Not mercy. Not the unconditional maternal grace that forgives all sins and smooths over all failures. I would give him justice. The pain in my chest didn't vanish. It sharpened, becoming a focused, icy needle of resolve. The arrhythmia continued, but my mind cleared. The survival instinct that had kept me alive for 68 years kicked in with brutal efficiency. I wasn't his mother anymore. I was his judge. And the sentence had already been written. I looked up at the yellowed intercom unit mounted on the laundry room wall. It was a relic from the 1970s, all wood grain plastic and chunky buttons that clicked with satisfying mechanical authority. Most people would have ripped it out during a renovation, replaced it with something modern and wireless. But Thomas had loved that intercom. He'd rewired it in the late 90s, running new cables through the walls, upgrading the system to act as a whole-house baby monitor. He'd called it the ear of the estate. You could listen to any room from any other room. You could broadcast to the entire house at once. And if you knew where the master override was hidden, if you understood the wiring diagram Thomas had sketched on graph paper and tucked into his workshop filing cabinet, you could turn any room into a transmitter. The study, where Julian was currently confessing to insurance fraud and murder for profit, had an intercom station. If I could trigger the master override, I could turn that room into a broadcast. Not just to the other rooms in the house, but to any device connected to the system. Like the Nokia still clutched in my sweating palm, currently maintaining an open line to Detective Miller. I dragged myself across the floor. My fingers caught on the rough concrete, the uneven surface scraping skin from my palms. Every inch was a battle against the crushing weight in my chest, against the exhaustion that wanted me to lie down and stop fighting. I refused. I reached the laundry room wall, gasping for air that smelled of Clorox and gasoline and 40 years of accumulated detergent residue. The junction box was tucked behind a utility shelf stacked with old mason jars. Dusty jars filled with Thomas's workshop miscellany, screws, washers, wire nuts, the accumulated detritus of a man who never threw anything away because you never know when you'll need it. I pushed the jars aside. They clinked against each other, a sound like wind chimes made of glass. Too loud. But upstairs, Julian was laughing again, and the buyer was counting coins, and no one was listening for an old woman dying in the basement. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the shelf, but the architect in my brain took over. I visualized the wiring diagrams Thomas had shown me. Red wire to the common ground. Gold wire to the speaker output. Green for the master bypass. Logic was the only medication I had left. I found the small flathead screwdriver in the bottom of the emergency kit, underneath where the fake pills had been stored. I used it to pry the faceplate off the intercom unit. The plastic cracked slightly, but the screws came free. The mechanism behind was simple, 1970s analog technology, all physical switches and copper wire. My vision blurred, the edges going gray. I blinked hard. The world snapped back into focus. Red to gold. Bypass the toggle switch. I found the red wire running from the master control. I stripped the insulation with my fingernails, the copper biting into my skin, leaving thin red lines where the sharp edges cut. I twisted the red wire to the gold wire, forcing the system into perpetual listen mode. The safety toggle that normally prevented feedback was now irrelevant. Every intercom in the house was now live, transmitting to every other intercom. A low hum filled the basement. The sound of an open microphone. The sound of the study upstairs being piped directly into the walls, into the electrical system, into the bones of the house itself. I had turned my home into a giant wooden recording device. I took the Nokia, still warm from being clutched in my hand, the screen still glowing that ghostly green, and grabbed the roll of old duct tape from the utility shelf. The tape was ancient, the adhesive dried out and cracking, but it held. I tore off strips with my teeth and secured the phone directly over the intercom speaker. The Nokia's microphone was now positioned to capture every sound the system transmitted. Detective Miller was still on the line. I could hear the faint, crackling sounds in the background, a police radio, someone laughing, the ambient noise of the precinct's night shift. "Miller," I whispered, though I wasn't sure he could hear me over the hum of the intercom. My voice was a thready rasp, barely human. "Record everything." I wasn't just a witness anymore. I was a producer. A documentarian. An archivist capturing evidence in real time. Julian's Minnesota Nice mask was about to be broadcast to the one man in Savannah who could dismantle his life as easily as he had dismantled my safe. A beam of light cut through the basement darkness, blinding me. "Found you." Brenda's voice echoed off the brick walls, triumphant and vicious. She stomped down the stairs, her heavy orthopedic clogs hammering each step. The flashlight in her hand swung like a club, the beam sweeping across the basement before landing squarely on my face. I couldn't see her features. Just the silhouette backlit by her own flashlight, a figure in white polyester that looked demonic in the harsh shadows. "You've had your fun, Eleanor." She advanced on me, her bulk filling the narrow space between the washing machine and the water heater. "Now it's time for your accident to start." She grabbed me by the upper arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. The grip was violent, professional, the hold of someone trained to restrain combative patience. She pulled me away from the wall, away from the intercom I'd just rigged. She didn't look up. Didn't notice the Nokia taped behind the mason jars, its screen glowing faintly in the darkness. She was too focused on her prize. On finally completing the task Julian had paid her to do. I let my body go limp. All the tension drained out of my muscles. I allowed my head to loll back, my eyes to roll slightly, my jaw to go slack. I put on the performance of a lifetime, the confused, fading relic Julian wanted me to be. The helpless invalid. The dying woman who no longer posed a threat. The gold, I wheezed, my voice a thready, broken thing. Each word came out as a gasp, punctuated by shallow breaths. The safe, it was just a decoy, Brenda. She stopped pulling. Her grip loosened slightly. Thomas. I let my eyes flutter closed, then open again, unfocused. He never trusted the walls. Too obvious. The double eagles, they're in the crawlspace. Her breathing changed. I could hear it even without seeing her face. Faster. Shallower. The sound of sudden, sharp interest. In the dirt, I continued, letting my voice fade as if I were losing consciousness. Right next to the red cans. He buried them in a metal box, 20 years ago. Before the cancer. Said if anyone ever broke into the safe, they'd never find the real. I let my head drop forward, as if I'd expended my last reserves. Brenda's eyes widened. I could see the greed reflecting in the flashlight's beam, even through my half-closed lids. The Mona Lisa smile was hidden deep within my mind, but I could feel it there. Cold. Satisfied. Precise. I was the bait, and I knew exactly how hungry they were. Brenda didn't even hesitate. She dropped my arm, letting me slump against the washing machine. Her hand shot out to the intercom button on the wall, the very unit I had just rigged to broadcast to the entire house and directly into Miller's open line. She slammed her palm against the button. Julian. Get down here. Her voice boomed through the intercom system, amplified and distorted by the perpetual listen mode I'd activated. It would be echoing through every room, every speaker, every duct in the house. And more importantly, it was being recorded. The old bird finally sang. Brenda's voice was electric with excitement, stripped of any pretense of professional calm. The safe was a front. The real stash is in the crawlspace, buried right in the middle of your setup. Get the buyer and get down here now. Upstairs, I heard the frantic scrape of chairs against hardwood. Footsteps. Running. Julian's voice, muffled but audible. Are you serious? She told you where. Move. The rats were heading for the cellar. All of them. Julian, the buyer, Brenda. Drawn by greed into the one place in the house where Julian had laid out 20 gallons of accelerant, where the fumes were thick enough to ignite from a static spark, where every word they spoke would be captured and transmitted. I leaned back against the cold metal of the washing machine, my heart stuttering in my chest, and waited for them to descend into the trap I'd built from their own avarice. 12:06 p.m. The basement stairs groaned under the combined weight of Julian and the buyer. They descended like scavengers moving toward a fresh kill, their footsteps urgent and uneven. The buyer came first, his expensive shoes, Italian leather, ruined now by the damp and the fumes, hitting each step with calculated precision. Julian followed, practically stumbling in his haste. Julian's suit jacket was gone, discarded somewhere upstairs in his rush. His white dress shirt was soaked through with sweat, the fabric clinging to his back in dark patches. His forehead glistened with a frantic, greasy sheen. His eyes darted toward the dark mouth of the crawlspace, a low opening in the foundation wall, maybe 3 feet high, the kind of space you had to crawl through on your hands and knees. The space where he'd stacked his gas cans, where he'd laid his fuse. Where, mother? Exactly where? His voice was a hiss, stripped of all pretense. No more Minnesota nice. No more concerned son. Just raw need. He didn't even notice the gasoline fumes were thick enough to choke a horse. The air down here was almost visible, the vapors creating a shimmering distortion like heat rising from asphalt in August. He only saw the finish line of his debt, buried in the Georgia dirt. The buyer was more cautious, his hand covering his nose and mouth. Jesus, Vance. How much accelerant did you use? Enough, Julian snapped. Now where are they? I leaned against the rough-hewn timber of the crawlspace entrance, my hand clutched dramatically over my heart. The performance had to be perfect. The dying woman, holding on just long enough to give up her final secret. Every breath a labor. Every word costing me something precious. There. I wheezed, letting my voice fade in and out like a failing radio signal. Under the loose bricks, near the fuel cans. I let my knees buckle slightly, sagging against the timber frame. The frail old woman, mass-perfected by decades of observing Savannah's elite hide their rot behind silk and pearls and garden club memberships. They scrambled past me. Julian actually shouldered me aside in his haste, nearly knocking me to the ground. He didn't even look back to see if I'd fallen. The buyer followed, his heavy boots splashing through the shimmering puddles of unleaded that covered the crawlspace floor. They were inches from the evidence of their own arson, surrounded by the accelerant that was supposed to erase me and this house from existence. Lured by the promise of gold. Julian wrenched the mahogany cases from the dirt. I could hear him grunting with effort, his fingernails tearing as he clawed at the lids. He'd buried them himself earlier in the evening, thinking he was hiding them from the fire, creating a narrative where the lost coins would tragically be discovered in the rubble, too damaged by heat to be worth salvaging. He threw the first case open with a triumphant shout. The sound died instantly in the damp air. Inside, there was no glimmer of gold. No silver luster of history. No carefully graded coins in their protective capsules. There were only dull, heavy lead slugs. The kind Thomas used for target practice at the outdoor range in Pooler. 50 caliber rounds he'd cast himself from melted will weights and old fishing sinkers. They had the right weight, the right heft. In the darkness, inside velvet-lined cases, they could pass for coins. Until you opened the cases and looked. Julian stared at them, his mouth hanging open. His face went through a progression of emotions, confusion, disbelief, dawning comprehension, and finally rage. The realization of the switch hit him like a physical blow. The gold he'd been planning to sell, the coins he'd counted on to erase his Minneapolis debts, the double eagles worth $250,000. Nothing but weight and disappointment. I straightened my spine. The feigned weakness vanished like smoke. My breathing steadied. The tremor in my hands disappeared. I looked down at him from the edge of the crawlspace, standing at my full height, all 5'4" of me, and let him see exactly who he'd been dealing with. I moved the double eagles to a safe deposit box the day you arrived, Julian. My voice was no longer a thready wheeze. It was the sharp, cold tone of the head archivist of Savannah. The voice that had corrected mayors and historical society presidents and pompous academics who thought they knew better. I saw the rot in your briefcase before you even unpacked your socks. The insurance claim. The accelerant purchase receipts in your rental car. The calls to black market coin dealers. I've spent 40 years cataloging liars, Julian. You're not even a sophisticated one. The buyer backed away slightly, his eyes darting toward the stairs. Julian remained frozen in the crawlspace, surrounded by gas cans and lead slugs, his expensive trousers soaked with fuel. A vault doesn't just store things, Julian. I let each word fall like a gavel. It protects them. And it certainly doesn't give them up to someone who can't even keep his own shoes clean. You're dead. Julian's voice cracked, the pitch rising into something primal and unhinged. This wasn't the smooth Minneapolis developer anymore. This was a cornered animal. He stood up in the crawlspace, or tried to. The ceiling was too low, forcing him into a half-crouch that made him look like some kind of grotesque troll. He brandished one of the lead slugs like a stone, his arm cocked back as if he might throw it. I'm going to burn this house with you inside it. The confession poured out of him, unfiltered and raw. No calculation. No pretense. Just rage and desperation. "I'll tell them you went senile and knocked over a lamp. No one will care. You're an old, heartsick relic, and I'm the only thing you have left." He was shouting into the humid dark, his voice echoing off the brick foundation walls, bouncing up through the heating ducts and the ventilation shafts. Every word was a vivid admission. Fraud. Elder abuse. Attempted murder. The buyer took another step back, his face carefully neutral. This was more than he'd signed up for. This was a man unraveling in real time, broadcasting his crimes to. I pointed a trembling, steady finger at the intercom unit on the wall. The little green light glowed like a malevolent eye, steady and unwavering. The on indicator that showed the system was active, transmitting, recording. "Actually, Julian," I said, my voice carrying the same archival precision I'd used for depositions and court testimonies, "you're speaking to the precinct. Say hello to Detective Miller." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the silence of a man realizing he'd just walked into a trap so perfectly constructed that escape was impossible. The only sound was the crackle of the Nokia flip phone, barely audible but unmistakable once you knew to listen for it. The phone taped behind the mason jars, maintaining its open line, recording everything, transmitting everything. Julian froze. His face drained of color, the tan from whatever Minneapolis tanning salon he frequented fading until he looked corpse pale. His mouth opened and closed like a fish drowning in air. The buyer swore softly and started backing toward the stairs. The ear of the estate had caught every syllable of Julian's ruin. Panic replaced rage. Julian lunged out of the crawlspace, his body moving before his brain could catch up. His hand reached for my throat, the final, desperate act of a man who had nothing left to lose. But the floor was a skating rink of his own making. His designer loafer, the Italian leather one with the little tassels, hit a slick patch of regular unleaded. The sole, meant for carpeted offices and climate-controlled boardrooms, had zero traction on gasoline-slicked concrete. His legs flew out from under him. He went down hard, his momentum carrying him forward even as he fell. His chin slammed into the concrete with a sickening crack, the sound of bone meeting stone, of expensive dental work shattering. He slid directly into the stack of red gas cans he'd so carefully arranged earlier. 5-gallon containers, stacked 3 high. They toppled like dominoes, the caps loosening, more fuel glugging out onto the floor. He lay there, sprawled in a spreading pool of accelerant, his white shirt now transparent and reeking, his trousers soaked through. A pathetic, shivering architect of his own downfall. Covered in the fuel he had intended for me. The basement windows, high, narrow slits of glass set into the foundation, suddenly erupted in a rhythmic dance of red and blue. The light was almost beautiful. Pulsing. Urgent. The color of justice arriving. The low, mournful wail of Savannah's sirens cut through the humid night, growing louder with each second. Multiple units. The sound multiplying as more vehicles arrived, their tires crunching on the gravel driveway. The living vault had signaled for extraction. I watched the light wash over the peeling wallpaper, the ancient brick, the cobwebbed corners of the basement. The shadows of the Spanish moss outside danced against the walls like celebratory spirits, swaying in the pre-dawn breeze. The sanctuary had held. The walls had done their job, not just protecting me, but capturing everything. Every confession. Every threat. Every moment of Julian's unmasking. This house, this decaying monument to history that he'd wanted to burn for insurance money, had become the instrument of his conviction. Detective Miller was the first through the door. I heard his heavy boots on the stairs, steady and deliberate. The walk of a man who'd climbed these steps 100 times over the years, coming by for Thomas's retirement parties, bringing casseroles after the funeral, checking on the widow Vance to make sure she was all right. He looked older now. His hair had gone from dark brown to a salt and pepper brush cut. The lines around his eyes had deepened into canyons. But his eyes were still the same, sharp instruments of justice that Thomas had respected and trusted for 20 years. Eleanor. He nodded to me, his face carefully neutral. Taking in the scene. Julian on the floor. The buyer against the far wall with his hands up. Brenda somewhere upstairs, probably trying to slip out the back. I reached into the pocket of my velvet robe and pulled out a slim manila folder. The dossier. I'd prepared it over the past 3 days, working in the dead of night while Julian slept upstairs. Photocopies of his insurance claim. Screenshots of his wire transfers. A detailed timeline of his movements. The names and phone numbers of the appraisers and the salvage dealers he'd contacted. Everything indexed. Cross-referenced. Annotated. Everything is here, Miller. The insurance drafts. The wire transfers from the buyer. And the audio from the last 10 minutes. I handed it over with the grace of a librarian returning a long overdue book. He took it, flipped it open, scanned the first page. His eyebrows rose slightly. You've been busy. 40 years of practice. The scene became a flurry of movement. White polyester and blue wool. Civilians and cops. The controlled chaos of an arrest in progress. Brenda was hauled out of the pantry by 2 uniformed officers, her wrists zip-tied behind her back. Her face was a mask of silent, predatory fury. No more fake concern. No more nursing professional veneer. Just the cold rage of someone who'd been caught. Julian was lifted from the gasoline-soaked floor, 2 officers supporting him under his arms. His Minnesota Nice suit was ruined, the fabric saturated with fuel. His jaw hung at a crooked angle from where it had hit the concrete. He'd need a hospital before he saw a holding cell. He tried to speak. His mouth moved, forming words, probably trying to offer one last manipulative lie. Some explanation that would make this all make sense, that would paint him as the victim, the concerned son dealing with a senile mother. Miller just tightened the handcuffs. Save it for your lawyer, Vance. As they led my son out of the house he'd tried to burn, past the marble mantles he'd tried to steal, through the doorway of the sanctuary he'd tried to destroy. I didn't feel a flicker of grief. I felt the satisfaction of a record finally corrected. An error expunged from the ledger. A false entry struck from the archives. I walked out onto the veranda. The cool air of pre-dawn was finally breaking the humidity's grip, the temperature dropping into the 70s as the sun prepared to rise. The Spanish moss swayed gently, dripping with dew. I sat in my high-backed wicker chair, the same chair I'd sat in every morning for 40 years. The wood creaked, a familiar, welcoming greeting. The sound of home. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the real vial of nitroglycerin. The one I'd hidden in the silver locket around my neck. Thomas's locket, the one he'd given me on our 20th anniversary. It had a hidden compartment behind his photograph, a secret he'd shown me with a conspirator's grin, telling me it was, just in case. I opened the locket, extracted the vial, and took a pill. I placed it under my tongue, letting it dissolve. The slightly bitter taste spread across my palate, familiar and medicinal. My heart began to steady. The jagged, erratic rhythm that had plagued me all night smoothed out into a calm, archival pulse. Steady. Predictable. Controlled. The sun began to bleed gold over the historic district, painting the white columns and the wrought iron balconies in shades of amber and rose. It was Friday morning in Savannah, and I was still alive. I looked down at the deed to the Vance estate, still clutched in my hand. I'd taken it from the safe deposit box 3 days ago, along with Thomas's coins. Just in case. Always have a backup. Always know where your critical documents are. It was more than paper. More than a legal instrument transferring ownership. It was a testament to the fact that I was still the curator of my own life. I took a deep breath of the salt-tinged air, watching the last of the police lights fade into the morning mist. The patrol cars were leaving, their job done. Miller had stayed behind to take my formal statement, but he'd given me this moment. This quiet. I opened my mental ledger. The one I'd been maintaining for 40 years, the catalog of Savannah's secrets and sins, the index of justice both served and pending. I found the entry for Julian Vance. And I drew a single, clean line through it. Case closed. Filed under, Justice. Subsection, Deserved. I closed my eyes and listened to the city wake up. The distant sound of cars on Bay Street. The church bells beginning their morning calls. The mockingbirds in the oleander starting their territorial songs. The archives were perfectly preserved. And I, the living vault of Savannah, had protected the only collection that truly mattered. The truth. If you made it to this moment, thank you for listening all the way through. Most people bail before the bill comes due. But here, the bill always comes due. What started as humiliation and disrespect ended with receipts, truth, and a payoff they never saw coming. If you want more stories where karma shows up without mercy, hit subscribe and come back for the next one. Now tell me in the comments, what was the most disgusting thing they did? What crossed the line for you?